I still remember the smell of rainwater and wet asphalt filtering through the open window of my kitchen that Tuesday evening. It was late September, the kind of transition week where the sticky Midwest summer heat finally breaks, leaving the air crisp, heavy, and full of quiet transition. I was standing at the island, chopping garlic and rosemary for a roast chicken, listening to the predictable clink of my husband's laptop keys from the dining room table. Mark had been working from home for 3 weeks straight, buried under a massive corporate restructuring project that kept him glued to his screen from sunrise until well after midnight. We were in that comfortable, slightly monotonous rhythm that happens when you've been married for 7 years. We knew each other's sighs, the exact pitch of each other's frustrations, and the silent language of a marriage that was solid, if a little tired. Then the phone rang. Mark didn't even look up from his screen as he reached for it, his thumb swiping the glass automatically. I watched him from across the counter, his expression shifting from a vacant, data-driven frown into sudden, sharp alertness. His eyes widened, his posture straightening against the back of the chair. It was a look I hadn't seen on his face in months, a spark of genuine, unpredictable emotion. He didn't say much at first, just listened intently, nodding as if the person on the other end could see him through the line. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an old familiar cadence, a tone he only used when talking about the years before he met me, back when his life was loud, chaotic, and unstructured. He hung up the phone and looked at me across the kitchen island, his eyes bright with a mix of excitement and hesitant anxiety. It was Julian, he told me. Julian, his absolute best friend from college, the guy who had shared a cramped, beer-soaked apartment with him in Chicago, the best man at our wedding who had vanished into the West Coast tech scene 4 years ago and barely kept in touch since. Apparently, Julian's life had just imploded. A bad breakup, a failed startup venture, and a sudden eviction notice had left him driving across the country with everything he owned packed into the back of a battered old Subaru. He was in our city, just 20 minutes away at a highway rest stop, running low on cash and completely out of options. When Mark asked if Julian could stay with us for a few days, I didn't even hesitate. In our social circle, you didn't turn away old friends in crisis. We had a beautiful 3-bedroom suburban home with a fully finished basement and a spare room that mostly gathered dust and Amazon boxes. I told Mark to call him back immediately and tell him to get over here. I even went to the fridge to pull out extra ingredients, shifting from a quiet dinner for 2 into hospitality mode. I wanted to be the supportive wife, the one who welcomes the prodigal best friend with open arms and a hot meal. Looking back, I hate how eager I was. I hate the naive pride I took in creating a warm, safe space for the person who would eventually burn it all down. Julian arrived just as the chicken was coming out of the oven. When I opened the front door, he looked completely different from the polished, charismatic guy I remembered from our wedding pictures. He was thinner, his jawline shadowed by a messy, week-old beard, and his eyes carried the hollow, exhausted look of someone who had spent too many hours staring at white lines on the highway. Yet, beneath the fatigue, that old charm was still entirely intact. He smiled, a slow, crooked expression that seemed to say he knew he was a mess but trusted the world to love him anyway. He hugged me tightly, smelling of cheap gas station coffee and cold rain, thanking me profusely before I could even welcome him inside. Dinner that night felt like a time machine. Mark and Julian slid back into their college personas so rapidly it made my head spin. They talked about old professors, late-night diner runs, road trips to New Vegas, and friends whose names I had only heard in passing. I sat there mostly listening, pouring wine, smiling at the right moments, feeling a strange mixture of warmth and mild alienation. It was fascinating to see my husband so alive, so animated by the ghost of his youth. Mark laughed louder than he had in a year, his usual stoic, stressed-out demeanor melting away under the influence of Julian's wild, fast-paced storytelling. Julian had a way of turning even his recent failures into a hilarious, self-deprecating comedy routine. He made losing his apartment sound like a grand adventure. Around midnight, we finally cleared the table, and Mark helped Julian carry his 2 suitcases down to the spare room. When Mark came up to bed, he wrapped his arms around me in the dark, whispering how grateful he was to have a wife like me, someone who understood the value of loyalty and old bonds. I fell asleep feeling secure, wrapped in the warmth of my husband's appreciation, thinking that having Julian around might actually be a good thing for us. It felt like a breath of fresh air in a house that had grown a bit too quiet. The first week went by smoothly. Julian was the perfect house guest. He kept his space immaculate, washed his own dishes before I could even reach for them, and made himself scarce during the day when Mark was locked in his office working. He told us he was applying for remote consulting gigs, spending his afternoons at the local coffee shop down the street so he wouldn't disturb Mark's conference calls. When I came home from my job at the architecture firm around 5, Julian would often be sitting on the porch, reading a paperback book, ready to help me carry my briefcase inside or offer to chop vegetables for dinner. But slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamics in the house began to shift. The boundary lines that keep a household stable started to blur, melting away so gradually that I didn't even notice the change until it was already too late. It started with the small things, the casual conversations that happen in the spaces between normal routines. Mark's workload grew even heavier by the second week, requiring him to stay locked in his home office until 9 or 10 every night, typing furiously, surviving on takeout coffee and sheer adrenaline. That left Julian and me alone in the kitchen and the living room for hours at a time. At first, our conversations were polite and superficial, focused on the weather, neighborhood news, or Mark's intense work ethic. But Julian was an incredibly intuitive listener. He didn't just hear words, he paid attention to tone, body language, and the unspoken weight behind a sentence. One evening, while we were waiting for a pot of pasta to boil, he asked me about my latest design project at the firm. It wasn't the standard polite question people ask just to fill the silence. He asked about the specific materials I was using, the philosophical concept behind the layout, and why I chose that particular career path. Nobody had asked me about my work like that in years. Mark loved me, but to him, my job was just a stable income stream, something I did between the hours of 9 and 5 before returning to our shared life. Julian listened with absolute, undivided intensity, his dark eyes fixed on mine, nodding as I explained the frustrations of dealing with demanding clients and corporate budget cuts. For the first time in months, I felt entirely seen, not just as Mark's wife or the keeper of the house, but as an individual with my own mind, passions, and inner world. It was an intoxicating feeling, a subtle rush of validation that I didn't realize I had been starving for. As the days turned into a third week, those evening conversations became the anchor of my day. I found myself looking forward to the drive home, wondering what Julian and I would talk about while Mark was working upstairs. We moved from professional topics to deeper, more personal territory. He told me about his childhood in Oregon, the crushing weight of his parents' expectations, and the agonizing breakdown of his last relationship. In return, I found myself opening up about things I hadn't even confessed to my closest girlfriends, my secret anxieties about aging, my fears of becoming stagnant, and the quiet, heavy loneliness that sometimes crept into my marriage during Mark's long, obsessive work seasons. Julian never crossed a line. He never made an inappropriate comment or tried to touch me. He was just always there, a steady, empathetic presence in the dim light of the kitchen, offering a sympathetic smile, a perfectly timed joke, or another glass of wine just when I needed it most. He became a fixture in my daily environment, a comfortable habit that felt entirely innocent because it lacked the overt markers of danger. There were no secret text messages, no hidden meetings in dark bars. Everything was happening right under our roof, in the open spaces of our home, while my husband was just one flight of stairs away, buried under a mountain of spreadsheets. One rainy Thursday night, Mark finally emerged from his office earlier than usual, looking pale and completely drained. He slumped onto the sofa next to Julian, rubbing his temples. I was sitting on the opposite armchair, a blanket draped over my knees. Julian immediately shifted the energy in the room, pouring Mark a glass of bourbon and launching into a hilarious story about a terrible Tinder date he had gone on 2 years ago. Mark laughed, but his laughter sounded hollow, exhausted. I watched them side by side, my husband, worn down by the crushing machinery of corporate responsibility, and his best friend, lean, unburdened, and possessing an effortless vitality that seemed to command the room. A strange, uncomfortable thought flashed through my mind, a sudden, cold realization that sent a shiver down my spine. I realized that over the last 2 weeks, I had talked to Julian more than I had talked to Mark. I knew more about Julian's current fears and dreams than I did about my own husband's daily internal life. When I looked at Mark, I felt a deep, protective affection, the kind of love that is built on years of shared history and dental plans. But when I looked at Julian, I felt a sharp electric curiosity, an uninvited flutter of anticipation that terrified me. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that this was just the natural result of proximity and circumstance. Julian was our guest. He was Mark's best friend. He was a guy going through a rough patch who needed a couch to sleep on. There was nothing malicious happening. But deep down, in the quietest, most honest corner of my mind, I knew that the emotional ecosystem of our house had fundamentally changed. The air felt heavy, charged with a silent, unspoken tension that was building toward an inevitable breaking point. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting sharp, blinding geometric patterns across our hardwood floors. Mark left the house before 7 for an all-day, in-person corporate summit downtown, kissing my cheek with a distracted, dry brush of his lips while holding a commuter mug in one hand and his briefcase in the other. He didn't look back as he backed his SUV down the driveway, his mind already sitting in a boardroom 10 miles away. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the red taillights disappear around the corner of our suburban street, feeling an unfamiliar, heavy weight settling in the center of my chest.
The house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic, low hum of the refrigerator. I poured a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, trying to shake off the persistent, lingering unease from the night before. I told myself that everything was fine, that I was simply overanalyzing a perfectly normal friendship. But then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards upstairs. A moment later, Julian padded down the steps, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and a pair of worn-in jeans. His hair was messy, sleeping habits written in the chaotic tufts near the crown of his head. He gave me a sleepy, half-lopsided smile that made my stomach do a sudden, uninvited flip. He didn't say good morning right away. Instead, he walked straight over to the coffee maker, poured himself a mug, and stood right next to me, close enough that I could feel the residual warmth radiating from his shoulder. We stood there in silence for a long minute, both of us looking out the window at the neighbor's neatly manicured lawn. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, thick with the weight of all the late-night confessions we had shared over the past 3 weeks. It felt intimate, far too intimate, for a Friday morning in my husband's kitchen. Julian took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes still fixed on the window. He mentioned that he had received an email from an old colleague about a potential project management consulting role back in San Francisco.
It was a good lead, he said, something that could finally pull him out of his financial hole and give him enough capital to get his own apartment again. He said it casually, but his voice lacked any real enthusiasm. When I looked up at him, I realized he was finally looking at me, his gaze intense, steady, and entirely unblinking. A sudden, sharp panic flared up inside me at the thought of him leaving. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I didn't want him to go. I had grown completely addicted to his presence, to the way he filled the empty, lonely spaces of my daily life, to the effortless way he made me feel interesting, attractive, and alive. The thought of returning to the quiet, predictable monotony of my marriage, where my husband was an exhausted ghost locked in an office, felt suddenly unbearable. I looked away quickly, focusing intensely on the dark liquid in my mug, terrified that he would read the desperation written clearly across my face. I managed to murmur something polite, telling him that it sounded like an amazing opportunity and that he definitely deserved a win after everything he had been through. Julian didn't answer immediately. He set his mug down on the counter with a soft, deliberate click, then stepped closer, closing the small physical distance between us. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing against my bare forearm to get my attention.
The touch was light, almost accidental, but it felt like an electric current slamming straight through my nervous system. Every muscle in my body went entirely rigid. He whispered my name, his voice low, raspy, and vibrating with an emotion he had spent weeks hiding. He told me that he had never met anyone like me, that these past few weeks had been the happiest he had felt in years, and that the hardest part of leaving wouldn't be the city, but leaving this kitchen, leaving me. He didn't step back. He just stood there, his face inches from mine, his breathing shallow and rapid. The air between us felt thick, entirely starved of oxygen, charged with a terrifying magnetic pull that I had been fighting against for weeks. I knew I should have stepped away. I knew I should have brought up Mark's name, reminded him of his best friend, reminded myself of the ring on my finger, or walked out of the room entirely. But I was completely paralyzed by my own desire, by the sheer, overwhelming rush of being wanted with that kind of raw, undisguised intensity. When he leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a tentative, questioning kiss, I didn't pull back. I let my eyes close, and for a terrifying, beautiful second, I lost myself completely in the warmth of his mouth, my hands instinctively reaching up to grip the fabric of his sweatshirt. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. It was a threshold crossed, a boundary shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. When he pulled away, his eyes were wide, dark with a mixture of shock and intense hunger. I stood there, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, gasping for air as if I had just surfaced from deep underwater. The guilt hit me instantly, a wave of cold, sickening dread that flooded my throat. I looked at Julian, seeing the raw complication in his expression, and without saying a single word, I grabbed my car keys from the counter and bolted out the front door. I drove to work in a total haze, running a yellow light and nearly missing my turn into the parking garage. The entire day was a blur of absolute agony. I sat through client meetings and design reviews, staring blankly at blueprints, hearing nothing but the low, raspy cadence of Julian's voice in my ears. I looked at my hands and felt completely disgusted with myself. I had crossed a line I never thought I would ever approach. I was the loyal wife. I was the stable partner. I was the person people relied on. Now, I was someone who had kissed her husband's absolute best friend in their own kitchen while the coffee was still hot. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, the sky had turned a bruising, dark shade of purple, promising another heavy downpour. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 30 minutes, my forehead resting against the steering wheel, crying quietly from sheer panic and confusion. I didn't know how to go home. I didn't know how to look at Julian. And worse, I didn't know how I was going to look at Mark when he came back from his summit. The web of deception felt like it was already tightening around my throat, suffocating me before I had even uttered a single lie. When I finally pulled into our driveway, Mark's SUV wasn't there yet. The summit was running late, and he had sent a brief text an hour ago saying he'd probably be tied up until at least 8. I unlocked the front door, my hands shaking so violently the keys clattered against the lock. The house was dimly lit, the lamps in the living room casting long, distorted shadows across the furniture. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Julian waiting for me, expecting a confrontation, an apology, or another terrifying moment of intensity. Instead, the kitchen was completely empty. A neat little note was sitting on the island, written in Julian's hurried architectural print. It said he had gone out to meet an old contact for dinner downtown to discuss the San Francisco job and wouldn't be back until late. Relief washed over me so intensely that my knees literally buckled, forcing me to grip the edge of the sink to keep from falling. I had a reprieve. I had a few hours to breathe, to clear my head, and to figure out how to bury this mistake so deep that it would never see the light of day. I went upstairs, took a long, scalding shower to scrub the phantom feeling of his touch off my skin, and changed into oversized sweatpants and an old t-shirt. I tried to domesticate my panic by cleaning. I threw a load of laundry into the washing machine, wiped down the already clean counters, and sorted through the mail. By 7:30, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming a loud, chaotic rhythm against the roof. I threw some leftovers into the microwave, but I couldn't eat more than 2 bites. The food tasted like cardboard in my mouth. Around 8:15, I heard the heavy thud of the garage door opening. Mark was home. My stomach clamped into a tight, agonizing knot. I stood up from the sofa, smoothing down my shirt, trying to force my face into a neutral, welcoming expression. When the door from the garage opened, Mark walked into the mudroom, looking utterly exhausted, his tie loosened around his collar, his hair slightly damp from the run between the garage and the car. He dropped his briefcase with a heavy sigh and looked up at me. In that exact moment, looking at his tired, familiar face, the sheer weight of my betrayal crashed down on me with the force of a freight train. This was the man who had held my hand when my father passed away. This was the man who worked 14-hour days to ensure we had a beautiful life, a stable future, a home to grow old in. And I had compromised everything for a few seconds of cheap thrill with a man he considered a brother. The guilt was so sharp, so violently nauseating, that I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from confessing right then and there. Mark walked over, wrapping his arms around me, burying his face into the crook of my neck. He smelled of rain, old paper, and stale corporate air. He told me he was so glad to be home, that the summit had been an absolute nightmare, and that the only thing keeping him going was the thought of coming back to this house. He held me tightly, his grip warm and secure. I stood there, completely rigid, my arms hanging loosely at my sides, before I forced myself to wrap them around his torso, feeling like the biggest hypocrite to ever walk the earth. He pulled back, looking around the quiet kitchen. He asked where Julian was. I told him, my voice cracking slightly before I cleared my throat, that Julian was downtown having dinner with a potential employer. Mark smiled, a genuine relieved expression passing over his tired features. He said that was amazing news, that he really hoped Julian landed the gig because he wanted to see his buddy get back on his feet. He then looked at his watch, remarking that since Julian was out and the rain was so bad, he was going to take a quick shower and go straight to bed. He was too exhausted to even function.
I nodded, telling him to go ahead, that I would stay down here for a little while to finish up some laundry and lock up the house. He kissed my forehead, a tender, lingering touch that felt like a hot iron burning into my skin, and walked upstairs. 10 minutes later, I heard the distant rush of the shower water starting through the pipes in the walls. I sat back down on the living room sofa, staring at the dark window, listening to the relentless assault of the rain outside. The clock on the mantel ticked away, the minutes dragging by like hours. It was nearly 9 o'clock. The storm outside was intensifying, wind rattling the glass panes of the front door. I kept my eyes fixed on the driveway, waiting for the headlights of Julian's old Subaru to appear, terrified of what would happen when he walked through that door, yet desperately needing to talk to him to ensure we were on the exact same page about keeping our mouths shut forever. Then the utility lights outside flickered once, twice, and the entire house plunged into pitch-black darkness. The storm had knocked out the power. The sudden darkness felt heavy and absolute, dropping over the living room like a heavy velvet curtain. For a long, motionless second, the only sound was the fierce, chaotic drumming of the rain against the glass and the wild rushing of the wind through the oak trees outside. My heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer with a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I sat completely frozen in the center of the sofa, my hands gripping the fabric of the cushions, staring into the black void of the room. The familiar lines of my home, the bookshelves, the fireplace, the coffee table, had vanished, swallowed entirely by the shadows of the storm. I forced myself to take a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. It was just a power outage, I told myself, a routine circuit failure caused by a fallen branch somewhere down the line. It happened a couple of times every autumn. I reached out blindly, my fingers sweeping across the smooth surface of the side table until they brushed against the cold glass of my phone. I tapped the screen, and the sudden, harsh, white glare of the display illuminated my face, casting stark, exaggerated shadows across the ceiling. It was exactly 9:14. There were no new texts from Julian, and my signal bars were fluctuating wildly, struggling against the interference of the storm. Using the phone's flashlight to guide my steps, I stood up, my knees still feeling a little weak from the exhausting emotional tightrope I had been walking all day. I navigated through the dark living room and into the kitchen, the narrow beam of light bouncing off the polished granite counters and the stainless steel appliances. I kept a stash of emergency candles and a lighter in the deep drawer right next to the pantry. As I pulled the drawer open, the house felt unsettlingly massive and empty, the darkness amplifying every creak and groan of the timber as the wind battered the exterior walls. I was just striking the match watching the small amber flame flicker to life against the wick of a thick vanilla candle when I heard a heavy, metallic thud from the attached garage. My hand froze, the burning match stinging the tips of my fingers before I instinctively blew it out. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, my ears straining through the darkness. A moment later, the heavy door connecting the mudroom to the garage clicked open, and the wet, squelching sound of boots on the linoleum floor echoed into the kitchen. It was Julian. I turned slowly, holding the single lit candle in front of me like a shield. The fragile, dancing flame illuminated his silhouette as he stepped into the kitchen. He was absolutely drenched. His dark hair was plastered against his forehead, water dripping from the tips of his strands and running down his neck into the collar of his dark jacket. He stood there, holding a plastic grocery bag that gave off the sharp, distinct clink of glass bottles, his breathing heavy and audible over the sound of the storm. In the dim, amber glow of the candlelight, his eyes looked incredibly dark, intense, and completely unreadable. He didn't say anything at first. He just shut the mudroom door behind him, locking it with a soft, deliberate turn of the deadbolt that sounded remarkably loud in the quiet house. He set the plastic bag down on the island with another heavy clink. He had bought a bottle of cheap whiskey and a couple of IPAs from a convenience store. He looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my oversized sweatpants, my messy hair, and the phone clutched tightly in my left hand. The silence stretching between us was thick, suffocating, and dripping with the unresolved tension of the morning's kiss. I cleared my throat, my voice sounding tight and unfamiliar even to my own ears. I told him the power had gone out about 5 minutes ago, and that Mark was upstairs asleep, completely exhausted from his corporate summit. I intentionally emphasized my husband's name, throwing it into the dark space between us like a boundary line, a desperate reminder of the reality we were supposed to be respecting. Julian didn't flinch at the mention of Mark. Instead, he took a step closer to the island, the water from his jacket dripping onto our hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic tap. He pulled off his wet jacket, draping it over the back of a kitchen chair, leaving him in a dark Henley shirt that clung to his chest. He reached into the bag, twisted the cap off the whiskey bottle with a sharp crack, and took a long, slow swig straight from the neck. When he lowered the bottle, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes never once leaving my face. He told me his dinner downtown had been a complete bust. The contact hadn't shown up, leaving him sitting alone at a noisy bar for 2 hours, staring at a screen, realizing that the San Francisco job was nothing more than a ghost chase. He said it with a bitter, hollow laugh that made my chest tighten with a strange mixture of pity and anxiety. He looked completely defeated, a man who had reached the absolute end of his rope, stripped of the easy, magnetic charm he usually used to shield himself from the world. He stepped around the kitchen island, closing the distance between us until he was standing just 2 feet away. The heat radiating from his damp body was palpable, mixing with the scent of rain, ozone, and the sharp bite of the whiskey. He looked down at the single candle burning between us, his jaw clenching tightly. He whispered that he had tried to stay away tonight. He had driven around the suburbs in the pouring rain for an hour, intentionally delaying his return, because he knew what would happen the moment he walked back into this house. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. He told me he couldn't stop thinking about the kitchen this morning. He couldn't stop thinking about me. Every logical, rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn around, to walk up the dark stairs, to wake my husband, and to end this madness once and for all. But I was entirely consumed by the atmospheric pressure of the moment, the total darkness, the isolating roar of the storm, and the raw, dangerous vulnerability of the man standing in front of me. The boundaries that had kept my life ordered and safe for 7 years felt completely artificial in the dim candlelit glow. Julian reached out, his hand surprisingly warm despite the rain, his fingers gently cupping the side of my face. His thumb brushed against my cheekbone, a tender, agonizingly slow movement that shattered the last remnants of my resolve. I let out a ragged, trembling sigh, my eyes closing as I leaned into his palm, completely surrendering to the illicit warmth of his touch. When he leaned down and pressed his lips to mine this time, there was no hesitation, no questioning. It was a deep, desperate and hungry collision of two people who had been starving in the dark for far too long. The candle on the counter flickered wildly as he pulled me closer, his arms wrapping tightly around my waist, lifting me slightly off my feet until I was pressed flat against the edge of the kitchen island. The phone fell from my hand, clattering uselessly onto the floor, its white flashlight beam shooting uselessly across the dark cabinets. I wrapped my arms around his neck, my fingers tangling in his damp, cold hair, returning the kiss with a fierce, reckless intensity that terrified me even as it consumed me. The guilt that had choked me all afternoon vanished, replaced entirely by a blinding, electric rush of pure adrenaline and desire. We moved together through the dark kitchen, guided only by the faint, dancing amber light of the single candle. Every touch felt magnified, every sigh amplified by the heavy silence of the house. It was an absolute betrayal, a systematic execution of the life I had spent nearly a decade building, happening in the very heart of the home I shared with the man sleeping just one floor above us. Yet in that blind, chaotic moment, I didn't care. I didn't think about tomorrow, I didn't think about the consequences, and I didn't think about the wreckage we were creating with every passing second. Hours seemed to blur together into a single, seamless continuum of shadow and heat. Eventually, the fierce storm outside began to lose its violent edge, the heavy downpour transitioning into a steady, monotonous drizzle that pattered softly against the window panes. The wind died down, leaving the night quiet, heavy, and thick with an exhausting, stagnant peace. I woke up with a sudden, violent jolt, my eyes snapping open in the pitch blackness. I was sitting on the living room sofa, curled beneath the heavy wool blanket I had pulled over myself at some point during the night.
The room was freezing cold. I looked down at the floor, seeing the faint, pale light of dawn just beginning to bleed through the edges of the living room curtains, painting the room in a dull, ghostly gray. My heart instantly leapt into my throat as a wave of absolute, unadulterated panic flooded my system. The haze of the night had completely evaporated, leaving behind the cold, brutal reality of the morning. I sat up quickly, looking around the dim room. Julian was gone. The living room was empty, save for the rumpled cushions on the opposite armchair, where he must have spent the final hours of the night. I stood up, my body aching with a deep physical exhaustion, my mind frantic with a desperate need to check the house, to clean up any evidence, to make sure everything looked normal before the sun fully rose. I stepped into the kitchen, the gray morning light revealing the empty whiskey bottle sitting on the island, a couple of damp rings on the granite, and the burnt-out, melted stump of the vanilla candle. I frantically grabbed the empty bottle, shoving it deep into the recycling bin beneath the sink, using a paper towel to furiously wipe away the damp rings from the counter. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely control my movements. I needed to get upstairs. I needed to wash my face, change my clothes, and get into bed beside my husband before he woke up, pretending that I had simply fallen asleep on the couch while waiting out the storm. I turned toward the hallway, taking 2 quiet, hurried steps toward the stairs. But as I reached the foot of the staircase, I froze entirely, every muscle in my body locking up as a cold, paralyzing dread flooded my veins. Mark was already standing there. He was sitting 3 steps up from the bottom, completely motionless in the dim, gray shadows of the stairwell. He was wearing his old navy blue bathrobe, his elbows resting on his knees, his head lowered into his hands. He didn't look up when I approached. He didn't say a word. The total, unnatural stillness of his posture was far more terrifying than any scream or violent outburst could have ever been. I stood at the bottom of the steps, my breath completely trapped in my throat, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it. The silence in the hallway stretched out, long, agonizing, and heavier than the storm that had just passed. I stood frozen at the base of the stairs, the cold hardwood floor biting into my bare feet. The gray morning light filtered through the narrow window of the front door, casting long, fractured shadows across Mark's slumped shoulders. I wanted to speak, to anchor myself with a lie, to utter any combination of words that could construct a shield between the reality of last night and the broken man sitting 3 steps above me. But my throat was entirely dry, constricted by a sickening, metallic taste of panic.
The silence between us wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight, suffocating and absolute. Slowly, deliberately, Mark raised his head. When his eyes met mine, a cold dread flooded my chest. I had expected to see fury, a raging fire of betrayal, or the sharp lines of a man ready to tear the house down. Instead, his eyes were completely hollow, rimmed with a deep bruised redness that told me he hadn't slept for a single second. His face looked entirely sunken, aged by a decade in the span of a single night. He looked at me not with anger, but with a profound, unadulterated devastation that cut through my defense mechanisms far deeper than any scream ever could. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't demand an explanation. He reached into the deep pocket of his navy bathrobe and pulled out a small metallic object, holding it out in the palm of his hand. It was my phone. The screen was cracked from its fall the night before, but the display was active, a single unread notification illuminating his fingers. I realized with a sudden, violent jolt of memory that when the power had cut out, our home security system had automatically reverted to its backup cellular network, logging every single motion event in the house and sending real-time alerts straight to the primary linked account, Mark's phone. He didn't even have to look at the footage. He had woken up in the middle of the night to the quiet, persistent buzzing of his phone against the nightstand, alerting him to continuous movement in the kitchen. He had walked down the stairs in the pitch black, guided by the faint, dancing amber glow of a vanilla candle, and he had stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching his wife and his absolute best friend tear his life to pieces. Mark lowered his hand, letting the phone drop onto the carpeted step beside him with a soft, dull thud. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, raspy whisper that barely carried through the quiet air of the hallway. He asked me how long it had been going on. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how Julian could do this to him. He just wanted to know the timeline of his own erasure. I took a trembling step forward, my hands reaching out instinctively, a desperate, pathetic gesture to touch him, to anchor him, to beg for a forgiveness I didn't remotely deserve. I began to sob, the tears hot and frantic against my cheeks, my voice cracking into a ragged, incoherent stream of apologies. I told him it was only last night, that it was a horrific mistake, a moment of madness brought on by the storm and the isolation, that Julian meant nothing to me, and that I loved him. I repeated his name over and over again, like a mantra that could somehow reverse time. Mark didn't move. He didn't flinch away from my approach, nor did he lean into it. He just sat there, entirely static, watching me unravel with that same detached, terrifying emptiness. He told me to stop. He didn't say it loudly, but the sheer finality in his tone cut through my hysterics instantly, freezing me in my tracks. He told me that the worst part wasn't the physical act. The worst part was that for the last 3 weeks, he had sat upstairs in his office, working himself to the bone to provide for our future, feeling a profound sense of guilt that he wasn't being a good enough partner to me. He had listened to our laughter from the kitchen, feeling a quiet relief that his best friend was there to keep me company while he couldn't. He had trusted us both with his entire heart. He had brought the ghost of his youth into our home, thinking it would breathe life into our marriage, and instead, we had used that trust to suffocate him. While I stood there, paralyzed by the raw, bleeding truth of his words, a soft sound came from the back of the house. The mudroom door clicked open, and the slow, tentative footsteps of Julian echoed into the hallway. He had stayed in the basement guest room after the storm cleared, and he was now walking out, likely searching for a glass of water or a way to slip out of the house unnoticed. When Julian rounded the corner and saw Mark sitting on the stairs, he stopped dead in his tracks. The two men looked at each other across the narrow width of the foyer. It was a confrontation suitable for a tragedy, the loyal husband and the treacherous brother. Julian's usual easy confidence was completely gone, his face pale, his posture defensive and small. For a long, agonizing minute, neither of them said a word. The history between them, the decade of shared apartments, late-night conversations, road trips, and unbreakable loyalty hung in the air like a corpse. Mark didn't yell. He didn't swing a fist. He simply stood up from the stairs, his tall frame towering over the space, and pointed a single, steady finger toward the heavy front door. He told Julian to leave. He told him to take his bags, get into his car, and never speak his name, look in his direction, or cross his path again for as long as he lived. Julian didn't argue. He didn't look at me, he didn't offer a defense, and he didn't try to explain the unexplainable. He simply nodded once, a faint, submissive gesture, turned around, and walked back down the basement stairs. 10 minutes later, the heavy thud of the front door closing echoed through the house. I watched through the window as his battered Subaru backed down the driveway, rolling past the wet oak trees, disappearing into the gray morning fog of the suburbs. He was gone, leaving behind a wake of absolute destruction that he would never have to help clean up. When I turned back around, Mark was already walking up the stairs, his back to me. He didn't look back as he reached the landing.
He closed the bedroom door behind him, and the sharp, definitive click of the lock turning felt like the final gavel strike on our 7-year marriage. The months that followed were a long, agonizing exercise in slow-motion survival. Mark didn't file for divorce immediately. Instead, we lived like ghosts in a haunted house, two strangers sharing a mortgage and a profound, permanent silence. He moved his things into the guest room Julian had occupied, a brutal, poetic irony that wasn't lost on either of us. We didn't fight. We didn't argue about bills or groceries. We simply stopped existing to one another. Every conversation was transactional, limited to schedules, mail, and maintenance. I watched him from afar, seeing the way he buried himself even deeper into his work, using the corporate machinery to numb the pain of his reality. The warmth that had once defined him was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable shell. And I was left alone in the kitchen every single night, staring at the granite counter, completely consumed by a crushing, relentless guilt that felt like a physical illness. I had traded a lifetime of safety, love, and building a home for a few hours of artificial intensity with a man who didn't even care enough to look back when he left. By the time the winter snows began to blanket the Midwest, the papers finally arrived. There was no grand courtroom battle, no dramatic division of assets.
Mark wanted the house sold, the equity split down the middle, and a clean, permanent break. He didn't want alimony, and he didn't want to negotiate. He just wanted to erase the landscape where his life had been ruined. On the day I finally packed the last of my boxes and prepared to leave the suburban home for good, the sky was a flat, unyielding shade of white. The house was entirely empty, the furniture gone, leaving nothing but the echoes of my footsteps against the hardwood floors. I stood in the kitchen one last time, leaning against the island, looking out the window at the bare branches of the oak trees. The power was back on. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, but the life that had made this place a home was completely dead. I realized then that the worst part of betrayal isn't the ending. It's the realization that you are the architect of your own exile. I had opened the door. I had welcomed the storm inside, and I was the one who had to carry the ashes of my marriage alone into the cold, silent winter.